Okay, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli wa nusallim ala rasulihil kareem. Amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. What I want to do is continue with our lesson looking at the metaphysics of Islam, which is the worldview of Islam. Now, there are words, there are terminologies that we will come across which might not be familiar to you. What I can briefly maybe just explain what they are. And if it's still not clear, then you can always obviously message me or ask questions when it's necessary. So in the last lesson, we reached till here. But what I want to do is just go back a little bit because we went a little bit fast towards the end of last week's lesson. So I want to start from here and just work our way through this passage. So remember, the author is talking about this idea of modern idea of multiple religions or multiple forms of truth. Okay, so the nature, so this is obviously problematic within Islam because we believe that there is one truth, there's only one God, there's only one truth with a capital T. So the nature of God understood in Islam is not the same as the conceptions of God understood in the various religious traditions of the world, right? So he's making this very, very clear right at the outset. Nor is it the same as the conceptions of God understood in Greek and Hellenistic philosophical tradition, right? So it's not the same as we would have understood it or how it's written in Greek law or Hellenistic ideas, nor as the conception of God understood in Western philosophical or scientific tradition, not the same God, nor in that of Occidental and Oriental mystical traditions. So this is really important because people sometimes think that, oh, these people in the East, the Orient, they have same gods, they believe in the same gods, whereas Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever else it may be, right? Islam is completely apart from all of that in its conceptualization of God, right? Really important because a lot of people now today, and the author will talk about this, a lot of people now today say, oh, we all worship the same God and it's all the same and so forth and so on. Now, this is really important. It's quite a heavy paragraph here, but we'll work our way through it slowly. He says the apparent similarities that may be found in between their various conceptions of God with the nature of God understood in Islam cannot be interpreted as evidence of identity of one universal God. So there may be areas of overlap. There may be places where we agree. That in of itself does not mean that we believe in the same God, right? That there's one universal God, right? So there may be things that we find in Islamic practice, orthodoxy, in our belief, in the way we do Islam, that may overlap with Christian ways or the ways of the Jews, or even other religions. That in of itself, the fact that there may be similarities, there may be apparent similarities. He uses the word apparent here very interestingly, does not mean that our God is the same, right? So just because something has similarity, so similarity is not the same as sameness. It's different, okay? For each and every one of them serves and belongs to a different conceptual system. This is really important. In other words, we have our own system of how we conceptualize things. They have their own conceptual system, which necessarily renders the conception as a whole, right? Because it's the way we conceptualize things is different, right? Or the super system to be dissimilar to one another. It's not the same thing here. Now, by the way, I haven't mentioned this. We're not talking about saying that we hate these religions. This is just basically a philosophical, metaphysical, logical conceptualization. So we're not saying here that we hate X religion or Y religion or Z religion. We're just purely approaching this from an objective Islamic perspective. Okay, and so this is important. Then he says this is really important. Nor is there transcendent unity of religion. So there isn't this like higher level. We might have different religions on this planet, but if you keep going up into generalizations, right? There's like one super system or super religion. There's this one transcendent unifying religion, right? So you might have all these religions all over the point towards one religion. That's not true as well, right? And he says, if you mean by unity, oneness or sameness, right? That's not true. And if by unity is not meant oneness or sameness, then there's plurality or dissimilarity of religions, right? So even though there's this dissimilarity or plurality of many religions, even at the level of transcendence, okay? Now, even if he says, even if you were to concede that there is plurality or dissimilarity at that level, and that by unity is meant interconnectedness of parts that constitute a whole. So like, even though they're dissimilar, these religious practice or whatever, these parts of these different religions, they may be similar, and you were to say, okay, we say that, but what we're saying is actually they're all interconnected, right? So some practice in Buddhism, something else in Hinduism, something else in Zoroastrianism, whatever, right? When you put it all together, there is something that is points to a whole, right? And so this, he says, doesn't work as well. So one is to say that there's areas of overlap, and he says, look, that doesn't mean that it's the same. And even if you were saying, even if you conceded that, okay, there are differences and these differences actually are interconnected, he said this doesn't mean anything. Okay, so as in here, interconnectedness of parts that constitute a whole, so that the unity is the interconnection of the plurality or dissimilarity of religions, right, as parts constituting whole of a whole. Then it follows that at the level of ordinary existence, in which mankind is subject to the limitation of humanity and the material universe, any one religion is incomplete in of itself. So like in this world, it's going to be incomplete, right? Is in itself inadequate to realize its purpose, and can only realize its purpose, which is true submission to the one God, to one universal God, without associating with him any partner, rival, or like that at the level of that transcendence. So even if you say, okay, fine, you know, there are dissimilarities, there is differences between religion, but in the end, it's all the same, right? But religion is meant to realize its purpose precisely at the level of the existence in which mankind is subject to the limitations of humanity and the material universe, and not when mankind is not subject to these limitations, as the term transcendent conveys. So he says that, you know, if you're going to say, well, we can accept that there's dissimilarities, there's differences, but at a meta level, at some higher level, there's similarities. He says, no, at our level, as human beings, with all our limitations, there must be, right? There must be these things that make us distinct. There must be things that we can recognize as unique to our own religious traditions, right? So this is something to bear in mind. And then he says, if transcendent is meant to refer to an ontological condition not included under any of the 10 categories, these 10 categories is basically referring to Aristotle. And Aristotle, so ontology basically is a theory where, in the most general way, you ask the question, what is there? What's out there? What's there? Ontology, right? And so in ontology, you'll find that there are usually 10 categories. In terms of, like, if I ask you what's that, at a general level, you will describe what something is, whether that's what's in front of you or whatever else you're talking about. At a very general level, you'll talk about it in 10 ways. Substance, you'll say that's a bottle of water. Quality, that's 10 pounds. Or quality would be something like it's hard or it's soft, right? So that's ontology. You're basically in a very general way describing something, right? What's out there. Or quantity, number 3. So, 10 pounds, this much, that much. Relation, so, it's brighter in relation to this. Or the awareness, right? Where something is. That's the 5th one, ontology. It's over there. It's in Chicago. It's in London. It's in New York, wherever. When? So when you talk about what is there, you'll say, at a certain time. Or you'll talk about position, which is number 7, right? Or 8, having. He'll have something. Number 9 will be action, right? He's eating, drinking, whatever. And the 10th one is passion. So these are like what's called ontology. We call them ontology, which is basically what is there, right? So we're trying to say something about someone. And of course, God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is transcendent, right? Allah is above all of these things. Allah doesn't have, to take an example, He doesn't have a quality. He's not in relationship to something else, right? In relation to a strong animal, for example, or passion or action, right? Allah is above all of these sort of things. Anyway, that was just a basic overview of or introduction to ontology, which is very, very important. So if transcendent is meant to refer to an ontological condition not included any of the 10 categories you just mentioned, God is strictly speaking not the God of religion, ilah, in the sense that there could be such a thing as a unity of religions at that level, right? So if you're saying that God is above these things, you're basically, he's above these things, but you haven't really reached what God actually is. You're not talking about ilah, right? Uh, at that level, so when you move beyond these 10 categories, ontological categories, at that level, God is recognized as Rabb. So when you recognize Allah is above, or God is above these 10 categories, these ontological categorization, you'll only recognize Allah as a Rabb, right? Rabb basically means someone who nourishes, cherishes, brings something out, right? Brings something to fruition, but not as ilah, right? Uh, because he mentions here later on that and recognizing him as Rabb does not necessarily imply oneness or sameness in a proper acknowledgement of the truth as you recognize, right? So when you say, when you recognize him as your Rabb, it's not necessarily saying oneness or sameness, right? Because Iblis, the devil, Shaitan, recognized God as Rabb, right? He recognized Allah as the Rabb. He accepted that he's a Rabb, but he did not properly acknowledge him. He didn't acknowledge Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says, even Adam's children, all of them have recognized Allah as their Rabb at that level, right? At the level of this ontology, that Allah is above these 10 categories. But you need to go a step further, right? Because even Shaitan recognizes Allah as the Rabb. But he says that it's not quite reached the level of ilah, right? So he says, but mankind's recognition of Allah, of him, of God, as such is not true unless followed by proper acknowledgement at the level in which he is known as ilah. So you move from a level where you accept him as the Rabb, in the sense that he's above these 10 categories, the ontological categories, which is fine, but that's not enough, because that's just you recognize him as a Rabb, which is what everybody does. Everybody knows Allah is a Rabb. He's the one that has brings everything and into fruition and everything else. But that's not what's expected of mankind, right? One has to recognize Allah as the Ilah, the God of religion, the God of Islam, the God of monotheism, right? So what is it that you have to acknowledge Allah as the Ilah, and proper acknowledgement at that level in which He is known as Ilah consists in not associating with any partner, rival, or like, and in submitting to Him. Number two, in submitting to Allah in a manner and form approved by Him and shown by His sent prophets. Right? This is what it actually means. His religion, the one He has chosen for you, the one that's above all of this. Right? So this is one way of understanding this. And then he goes into a little bit of psychology as well. He says, if you mean by transcendent, now transcendent, I should probably just quickly go through what this word actually means as well, because I haven't done that. Transcendent basically means in philosophy that it literally means climbing or going beyond. In this sense, it means that beyond normal or physical human experience. So Allah is transcendent, right? We can't experience Allah, we can't see Allah, we can't, He's beyond us, He's above us, right? So that's what transcendent, that's what makes him ilah, right? That uluhiyyat Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that He is above everything. Anyway, so going back to this discussion around psychology, he says, if you mean by transcendent a psychological condition at the level of experience and consciousness which excels or surpasses that of the masses among mankind. So you might have some really high level of consciousness, right, psychologically. Then the unity that is experienced and made conscious at that level, or at the level of transcendence, is not of religion. This is not religious, but of religious experience and consciousness, which is arrived right? So you might get to that level where you get this level, you get this feeling or a sense of psychological transcendence. But he says that only a few people can get this then. So you're from the elite, right? But he says religion is not meant to, religion is meant to realize its purpose for generality of mankind, right? We can't have a religion which is elite, right? How are people going to get salvation, right? If it's just for like people who are just gifted at a psychological level, right? And mankind as a whole can never be at the level of transcendence for there to be a unity of religions at that level, right? It's just not possible. Then if it is denied, right? Then if it is denied that the unity at that level is the interconnection of the plurality or dissimilarity of religions as parts of constituting a whole, going back to the point before, rather that every one of the religions at that level already exists, is not part of the whole, but is a whole in itself, then the unity that is meant, oneness or sameness, not really religions, but of the God of religions at the level of transcendence. Okay, so let's just sort of slow down a little bit because he gets into a bit more detail. So I think we're okay until here, right? That here we go. But religion is meant to realize its purpose for the generality of mankind. Really, really important passage. And mankind as a whole can never be at the level of transcendence for there to be a unity at religion at that level, right? That's just like, what about everybody else, right? Then he says, if it is denied that the unity at that level, that psychological level, is the interconnection of the plurality or dissimilarity of religion. So when you get to that level of higher consciousness or psychological consciousness, and all these different religions are united at that higher level, similar to what we said today, that all these different parts are part of this bigger picture, right? You don't accept that. Rather, what you say, that every one of the religions at the level of ordinary existence is not part of the whole, but is a whole in of itself. So every one of them is a whole in of itself. Then the unity that is meant is oneness or sameness, not really of religions, but of God of religion at that level of transcendence, esoteric, implying thereby that at the level of ordinary existence, exoteric, right? And despite a plurality of diverse, each religion is adequate and valid in its own limited way, right? So you're saying that everyone's valid, even if you don't accept it. So say, for example, we say, okay, we don't accept, we take it that you can't have the elite psychological level, but it can be, theoretically at least, that they can be religions at our day-to-day level, our human level, which are all unique, or which are all, they all have something special about them, right? He says that's another approach that people can have, right? So he says, rather that every one religion at the level of is not part of the whole, but is a whole in of itself. Then the unity that is meant is oneness or sameness, not really of religions, but of the God of religions at the level of transcendence. In other words, if you all say everybody has their own religions and everybody has oneness, sameness of themselves, then what you're saying is it's not a God of religion, ilah or pia, but rather he's the God of religions, right, with an S, at the level of transcendence, at the high level, right? So that means that at the level of our day-to-day level, ordinary existence, which we call it exoteric, and despite a plurality and diversity of religion, each religion is adequate. Everybody's fine. It's all good, right? Because there's a God of religion. This is shirk, right? And valid in its own limited way, each authentic and conveying limited though equal truth. So somebody might say, well, okay, we don't accept, we'll concede that there isn't this higher level, psychological level of transcendence, right? But at a human level, right, at the exoteric level, we accept that every religion stands on its own, right? It's a whole in of itself. And then if you go up, there's a God who transcends all of that, right? And so he's the God of religions, because all these religions are at the exoteric level. Okay. So he says this is like this. What happens when you do what you do with this? He said the notion of a plurality of truth, like there's anyone can be true, right? Or they are all true, of equal validity. They're all valid in the plurality and diversity of religions is perhaps aligned to statements. Oh, sorry, have I? Hold on. Yeah. So the notion of a plurality of truth, of equal validity, and diversity of religions is perhaps aligned to the statements and general conclusions of modern philosophy and science arising from the discovery of a plurality and diversity of laws governing universe having equal validity in its own, each in its own cosmological system. So this idea of like, oh, all these religions are valid, they're all, they all have some sort of valid truth, right? They're all equal in truth and they're all valid. It says this idea, uh, as Muslims, obviously, we don't accept this, but this idea comes from modern philosophy and science, right? Because they've discovered this idea of plurality and diversity of laws in the cosmos. And so what they do is they then do qiyas. They basically then they say, well, you know, they reason that this must be also applied to the universe, to the meta narrative, to God and other religions as well. Okay, so this is what he's saying. Um, the trend to align modern scientific discovery concerning the systems of the universe with corresponding statements applied to human society, cultural traditions, and values is one of the characteristic features of modernity, right? Modernity does this, right? This idea of everything sort of all of this of there's like multiple truths, right? So what you do is you confuse scientific discovery, or you conflate scientific discovery with things to do with universe, to human society, to traditions and values. Can you see? So science sort of moves from its pluralistic outlook, and it forces this outlook upon society, upon values, right? Can you see where this is coming from? So where do we get all of these ideas of values and so forth? We don't get it from religion, we get it from the scientific worldview. And so we're using science, then moves into a different domain which it doesn't really belong to. The position of those who advocate the theory of transcendent unity of religions is based upon the assumption that all religions, or at least the major religions of mankind, are revealed religions, right? So once you move from a stage where you say, well, in science and in philosophy, there's a plurality and diversity of laws, therefore society and values must be the same as well in terms of plurality and diversity, then religions must also have that as well. They assume that the universality and transcendence of esotericism validates their theory, which they discovered after having acquainted themselves with the metaphysics of Islam. Right? So they say this. In the understanding of this metaphysics of the transcendent unity of existence, they further assume that the transcendent unity of religion is already implied. This is a fallacy, right? They kind of extend this to religions from science. There's a grave error in all their assumptions, and the phrase transcendent unity of religions is misleading and perhaps meant to be so for motives other than the truth. Their claim to believe in a transcendent unity of religions is something suggested to them inductively by the imagination and is derived from intellectual speculation. إِن يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ, right? This is just conjecture and not from actual experience. If they denied it, if this is denied, and that claim is derived from the experience of others, they say, no, 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 we're not, it's not absent of experience. We've got other people telling us. Then again, we say that the sense of unity experience is not of religions, but of varying degrees of individual religious experience, which does not necessarily lead to assumption that the religions of individuals who experience such unity have truth of equal validity as revealed religions at the level of ordinary existence. Right. So even if people have this, it doesn't mean that there's somehow they're all valid, right? He's really driving the point home. Well, let's come to an end in a minute. Moreover, as already pointed out, the God of that experience is recognized as the Rabb. So when you're talking about religions or these sort of things, you're recognizing him as a Rabb, not the Ilah of revealed religion. He's above all of this, right? And recognizing him as Rabb does not necessarily mean that acknowledging him in true submission. So you might recognize that there is a Rabb, there is an there is a there is a God that is takes care of everything. But what does he say? You have to go higher than that, and you have to submit to that, right? In true submission follows that from that recognition, so you recognize Allah, you submit to Allah. And for rebellion, arrogance, and falsehood have their origin in that very realm of transcendence, right? That's why Shaitan knew who his Rabb was. He knew, the devil knew who his Rabb was, but he did not submit to Allah, right? Because of what? His rebellion, his arrogance, falsehood. There's only one revealed religion. It was a religion conveyed by all the earlier prophets who were sent to preach their message of the revelation to their own people in accordance with the wisdom and justice of the divine plan, to prepare the people of the world for reception of the religion in its ultimate and consummate form as a universal religion at the hands of the last prophet, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who was sent to convey the message of the revelation not only to his people but to mankind as a whole. So Muhammad, while other prophets were sent to certain people, certain tribes, certain communities, the Prophet Muhammad is the final prophet, and he was sent to mankind as a whole. Right? The essential message of the revelation was always the same. The essential crux of the message was always the same. Right? It was never different. To recognize and acknowledge and worship the one true real God, Ilah, alone, without associating with him any partner, rival, equal, nor attributing a likeness to him, right? And to confirm the truth preached by the earlier prophets, as well as to confirm the final truth brought by the last prophet, as it was confirmed by all the prophets sent before him, right? We'll stop there, inshallah. I think that's quite a lengthy discussion, so we'll stop there and we'll continue, inshallah, next week.